Always. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Atlantic Council's discussion on the future of U.S. policy in Syria. My name is Faisal Itani. I'm a senior fellow at the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East here at the Atlantic Council. You can, for those of you who are Twitter literate, you can follow this event on @ACMidEast and tweet @ACMidEast as well. We have a busy agenda today, as you can probably see, so I'm going to be very brief. We have a hard stop for a break at 1:20. We've invited you here today for three purposes. The first purpose is to highlight some of the Atlantic Council's work on tracking regime atrocities and war tactics and strategies in parts of Syria as a basis for accountability going forward, and also to speak with two experts on stabilization in Syria, a conversation that's been spurred by a new Atlantic Council report, about which I'll say more. And finally, last but certainly not least, you're here to hear from Ambassador James Jeffrey, Special Representative for Syria Engagement. There will be opportunities after these discussions to pose questions to the speakers and to Ambassador Jeffrey. But for now, let me turn to Mr. Graham Bookie. He is the director of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab. One question hanging over the Syria policy portfolio is, where does accountability fit into the scheme or the arena of stability and stabilization? Graham's team has done tremendous work documenting regime tactics and strategy and atrocities to that end, and the findings were captured, among other things, in two brilliant reports titled Breaking Aleppo and later on Breaking Ghouta, which you see on the screen over there. Graham will give you a snapshot about this work and how it's been done. For now, I'll cede the floor to you, please.
Thank you, Faisal. It wouldn't be the Digital Forensic Research Lab if I didn't open up a laptop before we began, so I apologize for that. Let me begin by saying the report, Breaking Ghouta, was a body of work that is consistent with what the DFR Lab does. What we'll do today is we'll show a brief trailer, and then I'll take you line by line through what we've found and the reason why we put it in that order. The point, again, as Faisal mentioned, is accountability. This is one of the most hyper-connected conflicts that we've seen in the history of the world. The evidence is right in front of us, and it's on us if we don't take that into account as we look at stabilization in Syria going forward. So, without further ado, Breaking Ghouta. Maybe. The evidence won't let us forget. In the context of accountability, the conflict zone in Syria is increasingly non-permissive for researchers, including those that are looking at the internet. It's harder to get consistent, verifiable information as Assad continues to consolidate control across the east and the south of the country. The DFR Lab has some experience with information environments such as this. A brief moment about the history of our team. The DFR lab was started in 2015. And at that point, I was actually sitting in the US government, and we knew for a fact that there were Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. And we couldn't call up the Washington Post or the New York Times and say, we know for a fact that there are Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. And by the way, you can't use us on the record, and I can't tell you how we actually know that. A group that would become the DFR lab here at the council wrote a report. And they wrote a report by looking at a lot of social media posts that Russian troops in eastern Ukraine happened to be posting while they were marching up and down the contact line in eastern Ukraine. The report it was called Hiding in Plain Sight, and it gathered a body of evidence in one place that literally proved, using open sources, that again, there were Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. The standard of evidence was selfies that were being posted on social media by Russian soldiers. Again, this is all happening right in front of us. The standard of evidence is pretty, if you know where to look for it, it's easy to do. So that actually became a body of work that the council has invested in over the last 2 years. We're set up to do 3 things. First and foremost, identify, expose, and explain disinformation with an emphasis on explaining disinformation. We do that only using open sources, meaning the point is to not say, assume our own credibility. For instance, trust us, we're the Atlantic Council. The point is to say, don't trust us, look at all of the evidence that we've gathered here in front of you and make a decision for yourself. That has been a body of work that has continued over time here and has led to reports such as Breaking Gouda. In the context of Breaking Gouda, our team scoured literally the dark reaches of the internet for open sources, from existing reporting to disparate social media posts to aggregating statements of actors on the ground, including those in the Assad regime and from Russia. As a logistical matter, and to tell the story of Gouda's fall, we first looked at how it fit into the wider conflict. Then we looked at the overall military tactics, meaning siege, bombard, and destroy. And then within the overall military tactics, we broke down attacks into specific categories of varying legality, meaning chemical weapons, incendiary munitions, cluster munitions, and attacks on hospitals. Taken together, each tactic created an increasingly dire humanitarian situation until the final militant group in Duma surrendered in early April. However, the military strategy was matched by a consolidated and very effective disinformation campaign. Disinformation has consistently been used, particularly by Assad and his Russian allies, and as an extension of the conflict. And the bigger point here, and the point of the report, is that there's a trap with disinformation to get into a back and forth or a he said, she said about what is true and what is not. Again, the point of this report is to rise above that back and forth, to say, this is not a viewpoint, this is not an opinion. These are things that we can either prove or disprove, and it's a body of evidence that can be used going forward. In other words, a body of work to drive accountability that doesn't assume that we're credible and meets evidentiary standards beyond reasonable doubt, useful for international mechanisms. Above all, it's a consistent body of reporting that still serves as a reminder that the eyes of the world remain on Syria. So, tactics. First and foremost, military tactics. Besiege, bombard, and destroy. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll look at specific instances, including the April 7 attack on Duma in eastern Ghouta. Chemical weapons were verifiably used. And we'll use that as a window into a consistent body of tactics and behavior that we've seen across the conflict in Syria. So, in context, consolidating the battlefield. The reason why Ghouta, the fall of eastern Ghouta, was a watershed moment is because it led to the fall of the entire southern front. So as the front overall in the conflict was consolidated from the east to the west and now to the south, eastern Ghouta was a stronghold outside of Damascus that led to the fall of specific fronts. So there on the map you can see military movements going into this specific conflict. Areas of control around eastern Ghouta from January 25 through the fall in early April. So in the last 6 months of 2017, the number of attacks on Ghouta was consistent but low compared to 2018. There were a total of 16,934 documented strikes in eastern Ghouta from February 18 through April 8, an average of 345.6 per day. On February 21st, 2018, the heaviest day of strikes in eastern Ghouta, 1,658 attacks were recorded. The majority of these attacks used traditional weaponry. However, some involved more pernicious weaponry that falls outside of international law. In Ghouta, at least 6 suspected chemical weapons attacks took place during the government's campaign to recapture the area. 5 of these attacks have been verified by examining images and witness statements collected following the attacks. The deadliest attack, of which we'll talk about in specifics, occurred on April 7 and precipitated Duma's surrender 1 day later, as well as prompting international outcry. On 5 days during the offensive, local activists documented multiple cluster munitions. Most of Eastern Ghouta's population centers were hit, injuring and killing individuals who appeared to be mostly civilians. The targeting of hospitals continued as well, with attacks in Arban Surgical Hospital on March 20 and Heydemann Hospital on April 7. Incendiary munitions appear to have been used in at least 25 attacks during the ground operation against Eastern Ghouta, with weapons being deployed primarily against urban areas on the front lines. At least 2 of these events appear to have caused mass civilian casualties, killing 100 civilians. The offensive concluded with the largest forced population transfer recorded throughout the conflict, with displacement of around 66,000 people from their homes in Eastern Ghouta to rebel-held north. Again, that's an average of 345.6 attacks per day in a civilian-controlled population zone using weapons that don't really respect whether you're a militant or not, or at least don't have the ability to be precise in a way that you would be able to differentiate. Total number of recorded attacks in Eastern Ghouta throughout that time period. There again, you can see that spike on February 21st. And just again as a rundown, a few statistics to keep in mind. 16,934 documented strikes in 49 days. 1,658 attacks recorded on February 21st, the heaviest day of strikes. There were at least 6 suspected chemical weapons attacks, 5 of which were verified, and we'll get into the standards of evidence here momentarily. Multiple cluster munitions attacks documented by local activists on 5 days of the offensive. Hospitals were targeted, including Arban and Heydemann hospitals, whose locations, and this is important, were previously shared with the Russian government, and 66,000 people displaced from their homes. Here we're going to focus on, because of time constraints, we're going to focus on chemical weapons attacks. Here is a map of the documented 6 chemical weapons attacks. And specifically, there's been widespread use of chemical weapons. So it's generally agreed, especially probably within this room, that chemical weapons have been used in Syria. At the same time, we run the risk over a 7-year conflict of saying something like chemical weapons are being used in Syria and not actually understanding or remembering exactly what that means and exactly what the evidentiary standards and exactly what the impact of that on civilians on the ground are. So, again, there's been widespread use of chemical weapons during the conflict in Syria. The OPCW Joint Investigative Mechanism, which is mandated by the UN Security Council to investigate chemical weapons used in Syria, has confirmed Syrian government forces have used both the nerve agent sarin and chlorine gas as chemical weapons. The United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic has documented dozens of attacks, while other organizations allege much higher numbers. For example, 198 attacks were documented between 2012 and March 2018 by the Syrian American Medical Society. When we talk about the evidence, it's important to talk about where it comes from. Here you have 3 very specific pieces of evidence that were aggregated by both local activists on the ground and verified by independent journalists. Again, when we talk about not assuming our own credibility, the point is to look at these, verify not only the pictures of munitions used, but also the locations that they're being used in. So on the right, or on the left, rather, my right, your left, the photograph of the chlorine rockets used in January 22nd attack of Douma. There you have a modified Iranian 107 millimeter artillery rocket with the warhead replaced by a large pressurized gas cylinder with additional tail fins added. Iranian rockets have been widely used and documented throughout the Syrian conflict. These weapons have a distinct olive color scheme, which sounds a little bit ridiculous to talk about Pantone colors while we're talking about Iranian munitions, but it is a useful mechanism to verify exactly what we're looking at. And text, as you can see, in English, which includes the name of the rocket, the lot number, the date, the net weight, and the marketing RO number, likely a serial number. This evidence makes it particularly easy to verify exactly what was being used. Also in this photograph, the warhead is covered in frost. As you can see, the cylinder just above the tail fins is covered in frost, and that indicates that it had recently rapidly released a pressurized gas, which contains in the warhead, which forms frost due to the phenomenon known as auto-refrigeration. The two circular objects protruding from the rear of the warhead are pressure release valves, and in other images from the attack, pressure filling valves from the front of the warhead are also visible. On the right hand, you see photos from attacks on the other days. And basically, the standard of evidence is that they're the same. Here you can see a munition that didn't explode with civilians, same munitions. On April 7, aircraft spotters working at Hala Systems tracked two Mi-8 HIP transport helicopters used by the Syrian Air Force to drop barrel bombs and chlorine bombs throughout the conflict, moving towards Douma at 7:16 p.m. At 7:38, the transport helicopters were seen just directly above Ghouta. Not long afterwards, there were reports of chlorine gas attacks. The two chlorine cylinders modified with an external structure that added tail fins were found at both sites. So there you can see in the top photo the exact geolocation of where that actually occurred. And on the bottom photo, you can see exactly what that munition means. At the balcony site, footage filmed inside the building showed dozens of bodies located throughout the building, many of which displayed corneal burns and heavy foaming around the mouth, signs of exposure to chlorine gas, which I will not go into detail today, but suffice it to say, the reason why this was so deadly is because chlorine gas is heavier than air. So everyone looking for cover within that building on April 7 took cover in the bottom reaches of the building. Chlorine sunk down and killed everybody within. The reason why those photos matter so much is because it is not the first time that we have seen photos exactly like that. Here are the same munitions that were used in Aleppo in 2017, or 2015 rather, 17 rather. And going into exactly why this is so difficult to prove, here's how we geolocate things. So here are photos that were taken from the day of, posted on Twitter. For those of you tweeting right now, #BreakingGouta. You take those photos, you piece them together into a wider scenario, cross-verify against open source satellite imagery, and spot exactly what happened. That's the evidentiary standard that we're looking at. That's why this is important. Again, the evidence won't let us forget. In terms of how we actually get a number of other pieces of evidence, here's a pretty good example. This is footage from the Russian military that was posted on RT. As you can see, it's an airbase in, well, I'll tell you, it's an airbase in Syria. But it's particularly interesting because of the munitions that are loaded onto that plane that are active. Here's a closer view. And as you can see, using the same methods that I just described, we have a serial number, an exact munition match, and that happens to be an incendiary bomb of Russian make and model. And so when RT posted this, they didn't actually mean to. So here's a version of the original version and an edited version as soon as they realized that they had just admitted using incendiary weapons in Syria. In all jokes aside, using every single source that's available to us is extremely important across the conflict. Every source of information, not to take it at face value, but to say, okay, this is something that we can work with and get a higher confidence assessment on the facts on the ground is extremely important. One important source of that is, of course, the Russians and the Syrian regime. To put this in context, the facts of the attack, and I would encourage you to read the report because it goes into details about cluster munitions, incendiary munitions, all of it. There's been a widespread disinformation campaign. As you can see, the commander of Russian operations in Syria said it on record, very useful because they are very forthcoming about tactics and behavior. But in the context of the April 7 attack, the precursor for the attack included a widespread disinformation campaign that was extremely effective, and it's in part the reason why we're having this conversation today, because there's still called into doubt whether this actually happened or not. I'm here to tell you it did. But here's how the disinformation works. False flag claims. So as international attention was drawn towards the chemical weapons usage in Syria and stakes were heightened with U.S. retaliation after Khan Shaykhun, the Russian government and its networks began a parallel disinformation campaign. Ahead of this attack, they basically, I was in Kiev last week working with folks that track disinformation. I learned a term called news of the future, which I think is a technical term that's very useful in this case. Ahead of the attack, there were narratives that said, okay, well, there might be we've seen rumors that the Syrian rebels, the White Helmets, activist groups on the ground are preparing a chemical weapons attack. And that's a narrative that sounds ridiculous to a room like this. It's also a narrative that gets widespread coverage, that gets consistent pickup across different information environments, specifically in Syria and in Russia. Factory of facts. Syrian state media reported a workshop by foreign-backed militants to manufacture toxic chemical weapons in eastern Ghouta. And then the Duma attack. So while Western governments expressed outrage at the attack, the regime and its allies, specifically Russia, called it a complete fabrication, something that they do to this day. Again, that sounds ridiculous to this room. But it gets amplified. And it gets amplified not only in those information environments in Syria and in Russia. Here's basically a network map of how that gets amplified across, including a number of what I would call conspiracy sites in the United States that get a lot of traction. So that's a very specific case. I would encourage you to read the entire report. It's a part of it's not just a one-off report. It's a part of a wider body of work that the Atlantic Council does on a regular basis, not only between the Middle East programs, but also the DFR lab. I can't say that it was including Putin at war and breaking Syria. I can't say that it was a pleasure to write this report. It was a pleasure to work with our colleagues, including Faisal, that helped contribute to this work. Again, they're outside. I would encourage you to read it. This is a hyper-connected conflict. The evidence is right in front of us, as you can see. If we ignore it, that's on us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Graham, for the tremendously important work. I do encourage you to read those two reports. Now, we focus on the thorny problem of stabilization in Syria. The Stabilization Assistance Review of 2018 defines stabilization as inherently political and an endeavor that requires aligning U.S. government efforts, diplomatic engagement, foreign assistance, and defense towards supporting locally legitimate authorities and systems to manage conflict and prevent violence. Something we've been working on here for a couple of years, and since we started the Rebuilding Syria initiative, and throughout the 2 years, we've gained a little more, well, much more rather, certainty about the geopolitical context in Syria, the lines of control, and also about our policy. We now know what the policy is this year, at least what it is on paper, which is enduring defeat of ISIS, getting Iran out of Syria, Iranian military at least, and bringing about a lasting settlement to the conflict, which means the stabilization discussion now has a policy context. And that's exactly why I've asked our speakers to join us today to give you a very brief version of their bios. Tamara Wittes is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. And Stephen Heydemann is a professor of Middle East Studies at Smith College, and he has held a number of leadership positions at the United States Institute of Peace, including on the Day After Project, which you probably read if you've been following Syria. They've both done far more than this. These are not their full biographies, but let me start by posing some questions to our speakers before we turn to an audience discussion. Steve is the author of our new Atlantic Council report titled Rethinking Stabilization in Eastern Syria Towards a Human Security Framework. So I will pose the first question to you, Steve, and then the same question to you, Tamara. How would you define, as you see it, U.S. interests in stabilization in Eastern Syria?
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you. And my thanks to you for your help with the report, to the Atlantic Council, to the Hariri Center for all of the assistance they provided in putting this report together. I think there are a number of direct interests that the U.S. has in stabilization in Eastern Syria. First, the campaign against ISIS was extraordinarily destructive, both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of civilian casualties. And I think it is in the U.S. interest to be actively seen in supporting efforts to respond to the damage caused in our campaign against ISIS in Eastern Syria. I think not only because it demonstrates to the populations in that area that the U.S. has a commitment to restoring some degree of normalcy in a relatively short order, which will contribute to the stabilization of the geography that the U.S. has been active in its military operations, but also because, quite frankly, U.S. support for stabilization poses a very important contrast to the way in which Russia and the regime have responded to the areas in which it has conducted military operations with far less regard for responding to the destruction that has resulted from their activities in those areas. So there is a local, more or less bottom-up set of interests that the U.S. can advance in engaging in stabilization. In addition, and here building on what you noted as U.S. interests, now that the Trump administration has set out a strategy that rests on three broad policy goals: reducing, removing Iranian influence, preventing the resurgence of ISIS, and achieving an irreversible political transition, there is a very, very strong interest on the part of the U.S. in acquiring the leverage that will equip American diplomats to advance those objectives on a number of different levels, locally, regionally, internationally. And stabilization could become a very effective mechanism in support of these broader policy aims. But in order to achieve that, I think we need a stabilization policy that is aligned with those objectives and that has been designed and implemented in a way that reflects an understanding of how our work on the ground can feed into our broader policy purposes. One of the arguments I make in the paper is that we're not there, that we're not really taking full advantage of stabilization operations on the ground. And as a result, we're in fact missing opportunities to fully exploit stabilization in support of our bigger policy aims. But we can pursue that. So I think both with respect to our local activities, our local operations, and our broader policy, there's a very clear interest, it seems to me, in taking stabilization seriously.
Thank you. What do you think, Tamara?
Look, at the broadest level, the purpose of stabilization, whether in this environment or any other, is to prevent conflict relapse, right? And I think what is important about the definition of stabilization in the U.S. government stabilization assistance review is that it recognizes explicitly that that's political. That's not just about reopening roads and getting the power back on and getting kids back in school. It's political inherently. And I think that's precisely what connects stabilization done in an appropriate manner to the political objectives that the U.S. government has enunciated for its engagement in Syria. It is the Syrian civil conflict that enabled the rise of ISIS. It is the Syrian civil conflict that created a wide open space for greater Iranian influence. It is the Syrian civil conflict that invited Russian intervention. And so unless and until that civil conflict can be meaningfully resolved, those negative possibilities or current negative realities will remain. The challenge for the United States is that it only has the ability to pursue that kind of stabilization policy, even if it's designed in the most effective manner, even if it follows your excellent recommendations, Steve. It can only pursue that policy in about a third of the country and not the most populated parts of the country. And that leaves wide open the question of how even a successful implementation of this kind of stabilization policy would interact with what's happening in the rest of Syria, which is, too, a political question.
Of course. We will actually return to that question of what are the implications of this conversation being had about one-third of the country. I do want to loop back to that. But first, the question for you, Steve. The subtitle of the report you wrote is Towards a Human Security Framework. From an academic perspective, I understand that to mean something specific. Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean?
Sure, sure. Yeah, human security is a field that developed out of a recognition that there are contexts in a number of conflict-affected, conflict-prone countries around the world in which it is states, state institutions, state actors who constitute the most significant threat to the security of communities, to the security of civilian populations. Syria is widely understood to be one of the most visible examples of this kind of a setting in which the biggest threat to the security, to the stability of local communities is the behavior of the Assad regime. And so when we begin to think about stabilization operations, one of the questions I think we need to wrestle with is whether we have an opportunity to use stabilization operations to improve the capacity of local populations to build governance institutions, to put in place security and justice institutions that will strengthen the odds or improve the prospects that they will be less vulnerable to the kinds of security threats that originate from their own leaders, from the institutions of governance like the mukhabarat, like the military, like a justice system which clearly uses law in an arbitrary and coercive way. To what extent can stabilization operations be used to give local communities some degree of protection from those kinds of interventions on the part of an authoritarian coercive regime? And I think in the Syrian case, we actually have an opportunity to use stabilization to advance those kinds of positive purposes. The argument I make in the paper is that one of the critical pathways toward achieving that goal is, in fact, by implementing stabilization operations that more fully reflect the stabilization doctrine that you referenced in your opening comment that emerged from the Stabilization Assistance Review that was released in June, July 2018. One of the principal findings of that review is that stabilization operations must prioritize the development of what is described in that document as locally legitimate political authorities capable of mitigating conflict and providing security. My sense is that we have not yet fully embraced that objective in the way we conduct stabilization in Eastern Syria. And there are reasons for that I can go into. I don't know how much time you want to allocate to this question right now, but I think one of the principal obstacles to a program that fully embraces that SAR doctrine is our reliance on the SDF as the agents of local governance in areas of U.S. operations. What we've done is outsource local governance to the SDF, which functions in effect as an extension of the PYD. And as a result, the governance structures we've established in our areas of operations cannot truly be considered locally legitimate. The local Arab communities in those areas do not regard SDF authorities as locally legitimate.
Let me interrupt you about the SDF because I want to ask you about a specific question about the SDF.
Sure.
But my question to you, Tamara, is whenever you have a policy puzzle like this, you have two fronts, the Syrian front and the Washington front. If you could talk a bit, in your opinion.
At least two fronts.
At least two, yes, that's true. Could you speak a bit in your opinion about what you think the main challenges are on both fronts to the kind of approach that Steve outlined?
Look, I think one of the clear implications of the definition of stabilization that has now been embraced by the U.S. government is that stabilization is a long-term exercise. And the biggest challenge that I think the United States has had in Syria generally since it actively intervened against ISIS, let's remember, is that it has made clear in a variety of ways that its intentions are not long-term. And it's that mismatch of timelines that I think has gotten in the way. It was true during the Obama administration. It's been true in the Trump administration. It remains true at this moment. And so I think one of the things that Steve's report illustrates well and that it's important to emphasize is that you're describing an opportunity, Steve, that exists within a very narrow window right now, which is a moment when the presence of American forces and other American personnel on the ground creates a meaningful deterrent against the Syrian regime trying to reimpose its authority on these areas. And that creates a window for the establishment of other kinds of political and economic realities on the ground in these areas. But if that window isn't, once that window closes on the assumption that the United States is not staying in these areas over the long term, and despite the policy objectives announced, the Trump administration has cut off its own funding for stabilization assistance and continues to insist, and the president intermittently himself insists, that he wants to bring American troops home from Syria as soon as he can, that the war against ISIS is almost won, and the time is coming. And so that window we can expect is going to close, and the Syrian regime is going to be in a position where it can either coerce in the brutal way that was just displayed before we sat down here, or it can bargain, because it's a lot cheaper to retake these areas through negotiated agreements. And so what Steve's trying to do here is lay out the possibility for the United States to help set some of the conditions under which the Syrian regime is going to make those choices. So even in the circumstance where the United States is not committed to Syria for the long term, which I think is realistic, Steve's approach can make things better than they otherwise would be.
Can I just follow up on that quickly? And I also think we have to emphasize the corrosive effects of this uncertainty about the timeline of the U.S. presence in Eastern Syria. Again, without suggesting that this is going to be permanent, or even that the longer term extends indefinitely into some 5, 7, 10-year kind of commitment. One of the effects is that we reduce the incentives of our local partners in the area to commit to constructive engagement with U.S. actors on the ground in Eastern Syria by making clear that our engagement with them is entirely instrumental, is entirely short-term, and will begin to wind down as soon as their support for the anti-ISIS campaign is complete, which has been among the more recent statements of Ambassador Jeffrey, and it'll be interesting to hear how he addresses that in a moment. The other is that it increases the incentives for local actors in Eastern Syria to begin making alternative arrangements, to begin withdrawing their loyalties already from the U.S. as a partner and shifting them elsewhere, in particular in the direction of the Assad regime. And we shouldn't kid ourselves about this. Eastern Syria is aggressively in play at the moment. And I try to highlight in the report some of the ways in which the Assad regime is working to reconnect itself and reinsert itself into the networks that it used to control that area before the Syrian uprising began. And it's having success. And I have to tell you, this is a perfectly rational response on the part of local actors. If you're not confident that the U.S. will be there to have your back as you try to build conditions that will give you some degree of bargaining leverage over the longer term, you're going to make other arrangements for yourself. And we see that happening all the time in these areas, even as the U.S. continues to claim that it's working to support these local communities.
Perfect time to ask you this question then. Which you talk about a lot in your report, actually. The policy elephant in the room sometimes when it comes to this discussion is the PYD. And the fact that we have an alliance with the PYD built on our mutual campaign against ISIS, but now we have kind of new policy elements that have entered the equation with an old foundation. So how do you think this impacts on the stabilization agenda and for that matter on the geopolitical problem?
You know, I think that relationship has all kinds of problematic implications on the stabilization agenda. I think we have to understand where the decision to focus so heavily on our relationship with the PYD came from. It's clear that as the U.S. became more engaged in Eastern Syria, we were looking for a reliable local partner who could support the anti-ISIS campaign. But in addition, we were looking for a local actor who could play a critical role in maintaining stability, in providing services, in offering some measure of local governance in the areas that had been cleared of ISIS. And from a U.S. perspective, the local partner that was easiest and most readily available to work with was the PYD. That had the benefit, by the way, of removing responsibility for local governance from direct U.S. As a direct responsibility of the U.S. And that aligned neatly with the very, very deep skepticism and reservations that had emerged within the State Department, within the policy system, about direct U.S. responsibility for local governance resulting from experiences in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And so this notion of working by, with, and through local partners emerges as a solution to direct U.S. control over local governance, local service provision, local justice provision. But in allocating that role to the SDF, we have opened a Pandora's box, in a sense. We have given the SDF responsibility in areas that are Arab majority areas in which Kurdish actors have never exercised authority. We have rekindled concern among the Arab communities in the East about Kurdish ambitions that the SDF's behavior have in fact amplified, reinforced, rather than tempered and mitigated. And so what we've done is create local perceptions of stabilization as a project of the SDF. And I think that's profoundly counterproductive to some of these other goals that we have attached to stabilization, especially if we imagine using it to advance the larger top-line policy aims of the U.S. As they're now defined.
You know, I think one reason why that happened the way it happened is because when the United States went into Syria, it went in with a very narrow policy goal, which was the defeat of ISIS. And so that alliance that was forged appropriately for the policy objectives then set, prioritized the defeat of ISIS, prioritized establishing relations with partners who could be effective in that project. And what happened after that was not within the stated goal of the intervention. Now American policy aims have expanded. And so this strategy needs to be reevaluated, and the partners need to be reevaluated. But I do think that there are two assumptions embedded. I don't know if they're embedded in the policy, but they are deeply embedded, I think, in the way the United States engages in this environment, not only in Syria. But I think it's worth making them explicit. One is one that you hear from US military all the time, which is and these are both understandable assumptions, which is dance with the one that brung you, basically, okay? We fought with these guys. They did the job we asked them to do. We owe them our loyalty and our support. And therefore, in recognition of their military power, they get political power, okay? The second assumption, I think, is an assumption that's rooted in CT doctrine, which is a sort of order versus chaos, okay? Areas overrun by groups like ISIS are ungoverned spaces, and you have to establish order. So you clear, and then you have to hold, and hold requires order. Any order is better than no order. These guys provide order. And, we've learned the lesson in Afghanistan that it does matter what kind of order you provide. We've learned the lesson in Iraq that it matters what kind of order you provide. We have to now apply this lesson in Syria, which is why the redefinition of stabilization is important, and it's why it needs to be applied in practice.
So you accept the order presumption, you just don't think that this is...
Well,
No. I'm saying it is not correct to say that any order is better than no order. It matters very much what kind of order.
Okay.
Right, and what we're seeing under SDF authority is a form of order that has turned out to be an extraordinary driver of local grievances, because the SDF is governing in a fashion that's heavy-handed, that has involved charges of arbitrary detention, of forced conscription, of inappropriate treatment of critics detained by the SDF, of heavy-handed management of local affairs in the councils that the SDF has established. We've seen mass resignations of Arab participants in some of these local councils. So we have privileged a form of order which in my view is having extraordinarily counterproductive effects on the possibility for stabilizing conditions in these areas that will prevent the resurgence of violent extremism, that will contribute to local security, local stability in the longer run. I think in many ways this emphasis on the role of the SDF is going to turn out to be one of the choices the U.S. has made that we may well come to regret, and I think in the not too distant future.
Let me ask you a geopolitical question. This isn't a conversation about geopolitics, but this one can't be ignored. The role of Turkey and the prospects of our stabilization campaign with respect to Turkey and our relations with them, given all that you have just both described about the foundations of our current policy, which is the alliance with the PYD.
Let me mention two ways in which I think the recommendations I've suggested here might actually help somewhat to mitigate current tensions with Turkey. First, I think a very clear signal from the U.S. that it's committed to building locally legitimate governance structures anchored in the representatives of Arab majority communities that are now within U.S. areas of operation will signal to the Turks that we are prepared to constrain the role of Kurdish actors in local governance in areas beyond those in which they have played that role for an extended period of time. In addition, I think the idea that we are devolving authority away from the SDF, that we are focusing our partnership with the SDF on the anti-ISIS campaign, is directly responsive to the concerns that President Erdogan mentioned only, I think, a day or two ago, in which he said we will not tolerate state-like structures in eastern, northeastern Syria. What we're making clear through these kinds of shifts in stabilization policy is that we are less, is that we are mindful that Kurdish ambitions to build a permanent or semi-permanent political presence in areas that vastly exceed those in which it's traditionally played a role does not have U.S. support. So it seems to me that while stabilization policy will not be the instrument for addressing U.S.-Turkish concerns, it could send some constructive signals about the direction that the U.S. is moving.
Yeah, I understand your point. Tamara, Turkey thoughts?
Yeah, I think this gets caught up in a broader dilemma for the United States in approaching Syria, which is, does the United States have a strategy towards Syria, or is its strategy towards Syria merely a subsidiary of a counterterrorism strategy, of an Iran strategy, of its concerns for the interests of partners like Israel in the south and Turkey in the north? I think one of the things that is implicit in Steve's report is that that the United States needs a strategy towards Syria. It now has some policy objectives that it's articulated, but it hasn't yet enunciated a theory of the case, how it's going to achieve these policy objectives, what tools and resources it's going to apply, and in what manner. And so it's very hard to answer the question that you're posing, how does this relate to the U.S.-Turkey relationship, to Turkey's interests, because the American strategy is not really visible yet, and perhaps in a few minutes we'll get greater clarity. I hope so.
That's the idea. Yeah, absolutely. Anything to add, Steve?
No, I think well said.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience. Raise your hand if you have a question. A mic will be brought to you. Please give your name and your affiliation briefly. And please try to be brief and ask a question. This way you take advantage of their expertise and you leave room for other people to ask as well. Barbara.
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much. This is really interesting. When the United States got involved in Syria initially with military aid, it gave money and weapons to a lot of individuals that turned out to not be reliable. Many of them wound up defecting toward Islamic fundamentalist groups of one sort or another. So if we were to adopt your strategy and not dance with the one that brung us, but look for some new partners, Arabs representing these various areas, what's the assurance that that assistance would not go to support Al-Qaeda or other fundamentalist-related groups?
Mm-hmm. And the gentleman all the way in the back standing up as well. You, Bassam.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Look, when
Bassam Barabandi.
Yeah, Barabandi, sorry, Bassam Barabandi, friend of Faisal. My sorry.
Everyone.
Yeah, it's BDC. My question is, or something we should think about it, that the Arabs or the Syrian Arabs, they failed to build good governing structures in Daraa, in Idlib, in Ghouta. They failed. They get all the money they need from the United States, all the support they need from the United States, and they failed big time. The Kurds, I will do here devil advocate a little bit. The Kurds, they build a structure. Now we believe it, good structure, bad structure, good political, bad political, but they have structure. They are running the area very well. So if we will go into to challenge that structure, and we back to the same Barbara question, the newcomers, how we know that they will have structure, governing body? Are we destroying a project to bring non-project, or do we have that time leverage to make the big risk? Thank you.
Sure. Barbara, there are so many ways in which a policy of devolving authority from the SDF to a wider range of local actors can go wrong that I wouldn't want to underestimate the possibility that we could make mistakes in how that process of devolution moves forward. I acknowledge that, and the report is actually quite open about the challenges involved in building locally legitimate governance within communities in a context in which there are dense overlapping local rivalries in which we have a variety of actors who will be competing to play prominent roles in local governance structures, in which we can anticipate all kinds of malintent in efforts to secure important positions in local governance structures. I don't think that distinguishes Eastern Syria from many of the other contexts in which the U.S. has worked over the years. But let's also acknowledge that the U.S. now has had a presence on the ground in Eastern Syria since 2015. We've been working closely with local actors there. We have been able to build up connections, understanding, knowledge that I would hope would inform the way in which we went about those efforts. I would also hope that we would use whatever leverage engagement with the U.S. offers as a means of leverage in our downward relations with local actors on the ground. And so that we're not, in fact, without means to try to build structures that are going to be less likely to collapse into the kinds of problems that you described than otherwise. But the possibility exists. Bassam, in response to your question, I don't think it is a choice between the PYD and a blank slate in Eastern Syria. We have long histories of local authorities exercising significant influence in governance affairs in those areas, especially tribal authorities. We shouldn't imagine that during the period before 2011, the Assad regime worked in those areas without transactional bargains between the regime and local actors in which there was significant local autonomy in decision-making at the local level. Many of those tribal arrangements have been destabilized by the conflict. We know that. We know that they're weaker today than they were before 2011, but they haven't disappeared. So I think we have to avoid the impression that we would be starting from scratch. There are local actors, local authorities, established figures who continue to command influence and have their own resources who could serve as potential partners for the U.S. This imposes on us, as I tried to say in responding to Barbara's question, an obligation to be very careful in how we go about managing those relationships. And we'll get it wrong. There are times we'll get it wrong. I'd like to hope we could get it right more than we get it wrong.
Let me just add one sentence, if I may, and I think this is, my one hesitation about the direction that you're recommending, Steve, is that it is so complex and challenging. And I think to determine, I think it is nearly impossible for the United States, even with knowledgeable folks out in the field, even working carefully and trying to make its best evaluations about how relationships have been altered by the conflict context, it's very, very difficult for the United States to accurately determine who's a legitimate leader in a local context, who can effectively provide security that a population perceives as legitimate. Really, in the extent to which existing social and power relationships have been disrupted by this conflict, given that extent, the only way to do it is bottom up. I mean, your main critique of the approach so far is how top down it is. And so doing that requires going so slowly, so small, and so local, your three guidelines, that at what point are you crawling forward so slowly that you actually have stopped moving? I'm the last person to underemphasize the difficulties that this kind of alternative has. But I think we have to recognize the trade-offs. Right? If we avoid engaging in an effort to reorganize how we pursue stabilization operations in Eastern Syria,
I think we can already see the pathway ahead. And I think it contains an enormous number of problems and challenges for the U.S., the biggest of which will be the extent to which it directly undermines our efforts to achieve top-line policy goals. So if we want to think about alternatives, then I think we need to begin exploring where the opportunities are to shift how we do stabilization operations in these areas along a different path. It is going to be slow. It is going to be difficult. I don't underestimate those concerns one bit, but I would just call our attention again to the larger trade-offs involved of staying on our current path.
Thank you. Gentleman in the blue shirt, right next to you.
Ken Meyercord, I produce a TV show. Shouldn't we be brought before the International Criminal Court for violating Syria's sovereignty with our incursion into its territory?
And you, sir, in black sweater.
Thank you. Namo Abdullah with Ruda Media Network from Iraqi Kurdistan. I just, you said you find it problematic, and you wrote it in your research, for SDF to rule predominantly Arab areas. But I don't know if there are any credible polls to suggest that Arabs in those areas are actually not happy with SDF because SDF is led by the Kurds. Because I haven't seen any credible polls like that. I think SDF might be opposed because of it is authoritarian character, not because it's Kurdish, because SDF is not a Kurdish nationalist group. There are a lot of Kurds in Qamishli who are not happy with SDF. I think so. I think just saying it's wrong for the SDF to rule those areas, it's like we are wrongly assuming that SDF is a Kurdish nationalist group. Thanks.
Good morning. Gentleman in the blue jacket. You, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My question is about the shift in the mindset between military mindset at the Syria Democratic Forces, and you have Mossad, which is Majlis Syria Demokrati. It's very, very challenging because from one side they are very empowered. Like we were on the ground, we fought ISIS, 10,000 people killed, and we know the world owe us, for what we did. At the same time, you try to really to work with them. Say, by the way, exit strategy for Northeast does not work only with your 75,000 fighters, because the regime in a week they will be there if the American leave. They understand that, they get it, but they don't know how to do. So I think there's a lot of education to be done, and I don't understand how that could happen in the short term.
You start.
Look, the question of sovereignty, I don't think that the U.S. should be brought before the International Criminal Court for violations of sovereignty. This was a space in which the Assad regime was not exercising its sovereignty for many, many years, and in which the challenges that we confronted, the rise of ISIS and all the rest of it, emerged from the retreat, the intentional retreat of the Syrian state and the regime from those areas, leaving them to local control, understanding exactly what would happen there. The idea that we treat sort of sovereignty as a blank check, that we acknowledge it as an absolute and totalistic kind of a construct that has to be respected under any and every circumstance, I think flies in the face of ideas like responsibility to protect. So I would view our presence there certainly as problematic in many respects. I do not endorse an open-ended, indefinite U.S. presence in that area. My view, and I mentioned this very clearly in the report, is that the most likely outcome over the medium to longer term in Eastern Syria is the reimposition of regime control over those areas. I make clear my view that a unitary Syrian state should continue to guide U.S. policy choices in that area. So I think we have to distinguish between a context in which sovereignty was compromised in large part by the behavior of the regime itself, in many ways compelling U.S. action in that area, and a longer-term context which I anticipate will bring about the restoration of Syrian sovereignty over that area, although I hope with very different conditions on the ground as that occurs. Sir, I agree. I think that the SDF absolutely looks at its role in the region through the lens that you described. And this is one of the critical challenges the U.S. faces. How do you have that kind of interaction with the SDF in which this process of the devolution of authority over local governance becomes something that the SDF is willing to accept, without also concluding that this represents the abandonment of the SDF by the United States? This is a very, very significant challenge. And I forgot the third question.
Ethnicity
Whether
versus authoritarianism.
What the issue with the PYD, with
Right.
The issue with the
SDF.
PYD is. Is it about Kurdish Arab or
Right.
is it about authoritarianism?
Yeah. Look, I think the SDF does have a very different conception of how to build local governance structures in the areas than would emerge from the bottom up. And so to that extent, I think what we're seeing is a conflation, is an integration of concerns about styles of governance on one hand and the identity of those who are governing on the other. And that, I think, the more closely those become intertwined, the more difficult it becomes to separate them. And this ends up looking like another round of a long-standing Kurdish-Arab conflict, which I don't think it needs to take on that form.
Nothing to add?
No.
Nidal in the back, please.
Thank you so much. Nidal Bitari, PDC. Actually, I think it's important to remember that the equipping and training program that was led by the US, it was problematic by itself. And this is where it started. It was not because like the people who were chosen for this program were not qualified or were not good or whatever, but the program itself, it was problematic. I have a question. Thank you, Steve, for the report and for the efficient brief. There is nothing looming that I don't want to be this optimistic, but there is nothing looming saying that the U.S. policy in Eastern Syria is efficient until now or will succeed in the short-term and seen future. In the current situation where everything is demolished, the social structure in Eastern Syria is demolished, and there is no clear policy toward rebuilding Eastern Syria, what's the future in the short term? Like, how do you see Eastern Syria in 2 or 3 years? Thank you.
Dia, please stand up. You'll get one. You'll get one.
The three of you actually mentioned about stabilization. You addressed the components in Syria and the US perspective, but the EU actually seems to be drifting from their position towards Assad. We have been seeing kind of like lack of uniformity from their perspective towards like the legitimacy of Assad. Probably we are speaking about kind of normalization of atrocities in Syria. Honestly speaking, after like 15 days trip between Europe, Lebanon, I came back recently. What I could say that there is literally lack of strategy in the eyes of the EU. They view Assad as the result or the solution for all this chaos in the region. Plus, would that leave the United States as the only voice against Assad? And I need just if you highlight the implications on the stabilization. Thank you.
Sure. You know, I think one of the things that comes through in Steve's report, but that I think is evident from a real look at what the United States is doing on stabilization now, is that the current approach on the ground in Eastern Syria is a tacit acceptance that this United States goal of a meaningful political transition is never going to happen.
Right.
And that the U.S. is essentially acquiescing in Assad's eventual reacquisition of control over these territories, and thereby, you know, if not creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, at least sort of enabling one. And, you know, if if that is where the United States is in a cold-eyed assessment of the future of Syria, then its policy does not match its own assessment, okay? So either it has some other assessment by which a meaningful political transition can be achieved, in which case it should share that, or it should have a policy that is in line with its own realistic assessment of the situation. Which gets back to the point I made earlier about the fact that we have policy goals, but we don't have a strategy, okay? I think you're correct to say that the EU also doesn't have a strategy. And I think therefore, in this reactive mode, seeing Assad with tremendous Russian and Iranian support reacquire control over most populated areas of the country, they are acceding to what they see. They're reacting and acceding. I think part of the value of Steve's report is that he illustrates the way in which not just declaratory policy, but actual programmatic work on the ground is reinforcing a reality that the United States says it doesn't want. So we can quarrel or quibble or be skeptical about the policy direction that Steve is proposing for stabilization assistance. It's hard, it's complicated, we could get it wrong, it will take a long time, it requires re-engagement in ways that we're not sure there's political will to support. All of that may be true, but at least let's recognize the political and policy consequences of what we're currently doing. That's important to start.
Right, and if we don't, what will Eastern Syria look like in 2 or 3 years? And I would expect two principal trends to dominate the trajectory of that part of Syria over that time frame. One is a continuation of the negotiations between the PYD and the regime that have already begun. They haven't proven to be very effective as yet. Visions about what the future of the PYD's role in northeast Syria should be differ enormously between them and the regime. But I would expect a continuation of those negotiations and perhaps the achievement of a mutually agreeable compromise about some limited level of local autonomy for the PYD in some areas in the northeast with a dominant regime presence in that area. Further to the southeast, around Deir ez-Zor and so on, I would anticipate a parallel process managed by the regime, engaging with local elites, local notables, tribal elders, to rebuild structures of authority and control that will advance a process of de facto reimposition of the regime and the reconsolidation of governance arrangements that look a little bit like those that existed before 2011. That if we don't make the kinds of shifts that we've been discussing this afternoon, that's my sense of what the trajectory is most likely to look like. In terms of the EU, yes, absolutely there is a debate within the EU at the moment. There are differences of opinion. There are member states that would like to see a process of normalization. There are significant conflicts within some governments about how relations with the Assad regime should now develop. France is one of those countries where Macron is surrounded by a variety of interests who are pulling him in different directions. I think that for the time being, the Mogherini policy of no reconstruction without meaningful political transition holds. I think it is being chipped away at. I don't feel it has yet been undermined to the extent that we'll see an EU-wide policy shift in the near future. However, there is a date to watch which will tell us whether that policy will hold. May 2019, the next EU parliamentary elections. There is very strong concern that the populist trend within the EU will actually produce majority representation in the EU Parliament for right-wing populist parties. If that happens, I would anticipate that support for the Mogherini policy would erode more quickly.
Yeah.
I think that's a good diagnosis.
Excellent. On a positive note, as always. We do have to break actually until 1:30, but thank you both, Steve, Tamara, for your time, for the discussion. I do urge you to read Steve's excellent report. And thank you all for joining. Please join me in thanking them.
Jim Wexler. I lead the Atlantic Council's programs in the Middle East. And you are here today for a program of our continuing Syria initiative. We very much enjoyed the first part of this program today, talking about stability and stabilization programs in Eastern Syria, talking about some important work of the Atlantic Council on documenting the atrocities that were done in Ghouta. And now we are here to hear from Ambassador James Jeffries. He is currently serves as the Secretary's Special Representative for Syria Engagement. Ambassador Jeffrey is the senior American diplomat with experience in political security and energy issues in the Middle East, Turkey, Germany, and the Balkans. He's held senior assignments in Washington, D.C. and abroad, including as Deputy National Security Advisor, as United States Ambassador to Iraq, as United States Ambassador to Turkey, as United States Ambassador to Albania. 2010, he was appointed to the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service, Career Ambassador. From 1969 to 1976, most importantly, he was a U.S. Army infantry officer with service in Germany and Vietnam. Thank you very much for everyone for being here, and thank you, most importantly, Ambassador Jeffrey, for joining us here today.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Atlantic Council, for inviting me here. But I'm going to take a step back before I talk about Syria. As many of you know, for 6 years up until August, I was in the think tank World 2, right down the road at the Washington Institute. And one of the benefits of being in a think tank is that you get to think about the larger issues of foreign policy and a broad sectoral analysis. And so, having been bitten by that bug, which you aren't really too exposed to when you're in the Foreign Service, I still try to follow up on my interests, even in my current job, which is pretty all-consuming. So I saw an article the other day, I don't know, it was in the Times, New York Times or the Washington Post, about how America once again, not that we ever weren't, is divided on various schools of thought on foreign policy, whether it should be isolationist or neo-isolationist, or, you know, to use Kissinger's two definitions in diplomacy, realist or idealist, internationalist, kind of blame America. You know, there are various flavors that you can use. But based upon what I'm doing with Syria, I realized that there was something missing. To all these analyses, at least as described in this article, of people weighing the pluses and the minuses of these things, they ignored, which is a bit unusual for an article on foreign affairs, the rest of the world. The rest of the world and how it acts gets to have a say in how we respond, assuming we want to respond as the most powerful nation in the world to events around us. We can respond to those events and respond effectively. I've certainly seen it. You've all have seen it. But we cannot really, I'm sorry, shape or determine these. We have to take the world pretty much as it is. We can tinker at the edges, but at our very best tinkering period in the 1990s, how many of you here want to stand up and say, boy, we changed the world fundamentally for the better in that period of time when we had all the power in the world? So you see the problem we have now, because now the world is different. And the Trump administration has grasped this with both hands, both in many of its policies, but also in its doctrine. The National Security Strategy, quote, in its introduction says, authoritarian states are eager to replace the United States, where the United States withdraws our diplomats and closes our outposts. The National Defense Strategy goes on to say that interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern in U.S. national security. It goes on. It is increasingly clear that China and Russia want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model. Again and again, at least in the introductory parts of these two documents, and you're all experts, you know that that's the part to look at, because the rest of it is just a laundry list of every single program we do anywhere in the world, regardless of which administration is writing it. But the upfront elements really signal where the administration is coming from. And this administration is coming to, has come to the conclusion that interstate rivalry with near-peer competitors is really, really important. And we have to deal with it. That gets to Syria. In terms of an internal conflict of the sort that we have known and basically been focused on for the last almost 30 years, since the fall of the wall and the end of the Gulf War, Syria is almost in a class by itself. You all know the figures. You talked about them earlier today. Over 500,000 men, women, and children killed. The largest humanitarian crisis, I believe, in the world since World War II. Over 11 million people. That's more than the total of all of the inhabitants of New York City and Chicago, driven from their homes. Half of Syria's pre-war population. The rise of ISIS as a manifestation of this malignancy. The waves of refugees that have destabilized, I would say, the entire political system in Europe to a degree that we have yet to see the end of. This is all the internal aspects of this conflict. But this conflict has also become a great power conflict. Right now, there are 5 outside armed forces inside Syria, along with the Syrian military, to the extent we can still call the Syrian military. And that is the American, the Russian, the Turkish, the Iranian, and in the air, the Israeli. And they're each pursuing important national security objectives, which in a couple of cases, certainly in the case of the Turks and the Israelis as neighboring states, they would see as existential. And so any policy that focuses on the situation in Syria cannot simply focus on the internal conflict. It also can't ignore it because it's crucial. But the two feed on each other. But as we go forward, we have to focus not just on getting this group to take that action vis-a-vis the government, to either lay down arms or take up arms or that kind of thing, which we've been doing off and on for the last 11 years. We have to focus on the international diplomacy because that is crucial for any outcome. The U.S. has 3 goals in Syria. First is the enduring defeat of ISIS. We're well on the way to seeing that happen. The problem is ISIS will come back if the underlying conditions are receptive to that kind of ideological movement, and that requires us to deal with the other 2. Not only to keep ISIS from coming back, but because, again, in the world of great power and regional competition, they're very important. First is the 2254 UN process, which I'll get into in considerably more detail, on a changed regime in Damascus that doesn't drive half its population away after killing roughly 3% of the population, killing and maiming over 3% of the population, and hasn't opened the door to all of these other horrors, plus a major escalation of Russian military involvement in the Middle East, which is not, does not portend for more stability in that region. So we want to see a regime that is fundamentally different. It's not regime change. We're not trying to get rid of Assad. We just want to see a regime, again, that does not produce the kind of horrors that we have seen. Finally, we think that Iran has to get out of there. When we say Iran, we're talking about Iranian ground troops. Iran will have diplomatic influence in Syria. It has had it for many decades. It will have more now because of the relative change in power of the Assad regime versus Iran. But Iranian troops, and particularly Iranian long-range power projection capabilities, missiles, rockets, air defense systems to protect them. They're a threat right now to Israel, which is why Israel conducts strikes against them. But they're potentially a threat to us, to our allies and partners such as Jordan and Turkey. So that's the policy. In doing this, once again, a lot of the focus, particularly in the last week with the contretemps with the Turks over the northeast, we've looked at individual areas. Al-Tamf and the Rukban camp down there, and our back and forth with the regime and the Russians on refugee, IDP relief convoys from the UN out of Damascus, pressures along the border of Al-Tanf by the regime. We've seen a variety of military engagements, including one in the last few days. Then the Northeast, our relations with the PYD in the fight against ISIS, vis-a-vis the Turks and their concerns about the PYD's ties to the PKK and their threats to come in militarily, as they have done twice before, in the north of the country in Euphrates Shield, and then later in Afrin at the beginning of this year. So, and then of course there's the Idlib ceasefire agreement, which is holding more or less between the Turks and the Russians, with the Iranians having come in later, but all kinds of conditions that are hard for the Turks to meet, such as clearing the main M4, M5 road and getting all of the hardcore terrorists from mainly, but not only Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, back from the deconfliction zone, and eventually, according to the sort of the understandings related to the Idlib agreement, basically getting rid of that organization physically in one or another way. But more generally, what we have for the first time is, other than along the Merv, where the final fight against ISIS is being carried out, relative peace and relative calm throughout all of Syria. There are some shellings in Idlib. There's shooting back and forth between the Turks and the Kurds along the border and around Manbij. And as I said, there was an incident in Al-Tanf. But compared to what normally was the fare that this conflict has dished up since 2011, it is relatively peaceful. We believe that this allows a brief opportunity for diplomacy to work. In looking at diplomacy, we see UN Resolution 2254 as the road forward. That resolution, entitled Endorsing Roadmap for Peace Process in Syria, was unanimously adopted almost 3 years ago to the day on December 18th, 2015. It presents pragmatic steps in a path to peace in Syria for all Syrians, a de-escalation in violence across the country, unhindered humanitarian access, and the convening of UN negotiations to draft a new constitution and hold free and fair elections. The reason that it's unanimous is that its principle is there is no military solution. Now, occasionally, or not occasionally, all of the time, we think that the regime believes in a military solution, but the regime doesn't have the military power to effect that. It has to rely on essentially infantry provided by the Iranians and air power provided by the Russians. And they have other interests, and we thus think that there is an opportunity to move forward on the political track. Right now, most of the attention, and this week will be the denouement of it, so to speak, has been with the Astana process and the Sochi agreement, again, of a year ago, where the Astana Three, that is Turkey, Iran, and Russia, brought together originally to negotiate deconfliction zones, agreed with some support from the U.S. and from the UN to take on the job of calling forth a constitutional committee to execute the first of 4 major tracks in the political process. That is, to draft either a revised or a new constitution. That has been in fits and starts moving forward for the last year. We're very close to a potential breakthrough or a breakdown this week. We'll find out by Thursday at the UN Security Council meeting on Syria, where Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy, set up, well, he was actually there before 2254, but 2254 reinforced his role, will pronounce the verdict on this Astana effort. The foreign ministers of the 3 countries are going to meet with de Mistura tomorrow in Geneva. They're already talking at the sub-minister level to figure out if the list that they have put together meets the standards of the UN for a credible list of people that represent truly the opposition, the government, and civil society, basically neutral people. The Turks and the Russians have told us that they do meet that criteria. The opposition, headed by the Syria negotiating committee, has declared that right now they do not accept the list. That's a huge problem for de Mistura. He has to decide and report back to the Secretary General. So all this is happening as we're talking here right now. We believe that there is a chance that we can see a breakthrough with the Constitutional Committee called forth in early January, because the list will be accepted by the UN and by, frankly, all of us. But right now, we're not there. And the question, which has been the question throughout this entire negotiation on the Constitutional Committee and on all of the other efforts dating back to 2012 to try to resolve this conflict, is the regime willing to give an iota of compromise to any effort by the international community to try to resolve this on terms other than the regime's? Because the international community is not going to resolve it on terms favorable to the regime unless it has to, and it doesn't have to. The regime has not won this conflict. Over 40% of the territory is in other people's hands. There's over 100,000, counting the PYD, over 100,000 armed opposition forces in the country, still active. The areas where the Assad regime rules, again, have only 50% of the population. It's largely rubble because of the way that the Iranians, and particularly the Russians, carried out actions in the cities against opposition. And it will require, depending upon the estimate, $300 to $400 billion to rebuild. Who's going to pay that bill? After Lebanon was torn apart by Hezbollah's attacking across the border into Israel in 2006, I'll tell you who paid the bill, because I was involved in it. It was North America, Western Europe, and the international financial institutions largely funded and supported by us. That is, we paid the bill for something that an Iranian surrogate launched. That's not going to happen again. There's a strong readiness on the part of Western nations not to ante up money for that disaster unless we have some kind of idea that the government is ready to compromise and thus not create yet another horror in the years ahead. So those are the pressure points that we have to try to push, if not the Assad regime, then at least the Russians and the Iranians forward. We're not asking for regime change. We're not asking for the Russians to leave. What we're asking for is a compromise settlement. We'll see if we get it. In terms of the Constitutional Committee, the question is, how will this committee work? Who will be in charge of it? Again, Stefan de Mistura, who will be leaving this week on the 20th, has come up with, we think, reasonable ways forward of ensuring that this is a Syrian-led process. Once again, he has to fend off efforts by the regime to, for example, have this Constitutional Committee meet in Damascus, to have it under the shadow of the Astana Group, whose interests are not the same as that of the international community. Those are the things that we're basically going back and forth on, again, as we're speaking here today. The commitment to move forward on this was strongly reinforced in Istanbul at the end of October in a meeting of the presidents of Russia, Turkey, and France, and the Chancellor of Germany to press on two areas of concern to everybody in Syria. First is Idlib, in part because of the 3.5 million people who were there and the fear that they would have no place to go if there was a major offensive, thus to support a, to quote the document that came out of Istanbul, lasting ceasefire in Idlib. And the second thing is to convene the Constitutional Committee by the end of December. Well, we're almost at the end of December, so we'll see what happens in the days ahead. Now, two scenarios. Scenario A is we do get this Constitutional Committee. This will have a strong effect on, if you will, politicizing and diplomatizing the conflict. We already have, as I said, a de facto ceasefire, a set of ceasefires around the country. But in every area, they're different. We have an agreement with the Turks on Manbij. The Turks and the Russians have an agreement on Idlib. We have no agreement with anybody on Al-Tanf, and on and on and on. What we're trying to do is to move that, again, in the direction of the path forward laid out in 2254. 2254, because it's what we've been focusing on for 3 years, talks a lot about the political process, but it also talks a lot about de-escalation. De-escalation, and this was something that President Trump emphasized in his various comments on Syria up in New York, because he believes very much in this. De-escalation is absolutely necessary to support the political process. The political process, in turn, if you get progress on it, such as convening the Constitutional Committee, will support de-escalation, because the more you have a viable political process, the harder it is for any of the actors to violate it by launching yet another offensive. So, both in a political, logical sense, moving forward on the Constitutional Committee is important for the maintenance of these ceasefires and thus for relative peace in Syria. But it also opens the door to paragraphs 5, 6, and 7 of 2254, which talks in detail about a set of ceasefires managed or monitored by the UN, ultimately for a nationwide ceasefire. We think that's a good idea. We want to move forward on that. We're working with various of our friends. We've talked with the Russians about this. We don't have a lot of agreement so far, but we think that it's the logical next step, again, using 2254 as the overall roadmap for a resolution of this conflict. When I talk to people about this, sometimes with some people their eyes glaze over, because we've seen so many initiatives, we've seen so many efforts to try to end this conflict, and it just rolls on and on. Well, first of all, we're at a point now where it's no longer a conflict between part of the population and the government. It's, to a significant degree now, pulled in outside powers. It's a different kind of conflict. It also is no longer involving active fighting. That could change tomorrow, but for the moment we have an opportunity. Finally, there is the question: if the bulk of the Arab world, Europe, the United States, and international agencies and organizations hold the line and say, without following 2254, we are not going to provide support for the Assad regime, what is the Assad regime going to do? How is it going to win back the other half of its population? Certainly, Assad is no advertisement for coming home. How is it going to gain the territory? And most importantly, how is it going to rebuild its devastated infrastructure and cities? That's the question that we pose not to the Assad regime, because we don't talk to them, but we pose to the Russians all the time. We're still waiting for an answer. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions. Back to my seat.
Yeah, why don't you take your seat? Okay, I'm going to call on 4 or 5 or so questions, and then the ambassador will unfortunately have to leave. Let me start in the back first, back corner. Yep.
Sorry, Diane Nissenbaum with the Wall Street Journal. I came in a little late. I don't know if you touched on this, but there's tensions, as you know, with Turkey at this point. President Trump and President Erdogan spoke on Friday. That has the potential, as you know, to blow up in the faces. Can you give us some update on where things stand on the efforts to prevent Turkey from launching a new offensive?
Sure. There has been a considerable buildup of tension between Turkey, the U.S., and our partner in northeast Syria in the fight against ISIS, the SDF, which is largely in the hands of or controlled by the PYD, which has links to the PKK. And this is of concern to Turkey. We understand its concerns. We're committed to Turkey's security, and we've been talking extensively to the Turks. I spent 3 days there the week before last. Given the threats of marching in to deal with this problem themselves, the U.S. at every level has reached out to the Turks, including Friday a call from President Trump to President Erdogan. We have to wait and see. I believe that the situation has calmed somewhat. I believe that we're willing to work with the Turks and with the people on the ground to find a way forward. We share mainly the same objectives in most areas, and as I said, we're very focused on Turkish security. But we also are very focused on finishing the fight against ISIS. So we're going to be, again, managing this and monitoring this very closely.
Okay. Ma'am, right
In the beginning, you were talking about...
Can you please introduce yourself?
I'm Mary Carrick. You were talking about us wanting to fight against ISIS. And then this talk is the first time I've heard that our goal is not regime change, but I'm wondering how likely it won't be regime change if the international community is setting up a constitution and election, and if there is regime change, which we've done in several other countries, and it actually caused ISIS. I don't see how this can be a good
I think
outcome.
regime change is a term of art applied to American direct efforts, often military or covert in nature, against the Iranian regime in 1953, against Saddam in 2003, against Gaddafi in 2011, where we're trying to get rid of a leader and change, to some degree, the state, or the nature of the state, the nature of the governance of the state on our own. That's not what we're about. This is a UN process that the international community has agreed to, and there's nothing unusual about that. If you go back over the last 30, 40 years in conflicts, particularly internal conflicts, there's been a commitment either by the nation involved or by the international community that there has to be changes in governance in that country to avoid keeping peacekeepers there forever, or having 500,000 people killed, or just having a conflict that spills over into the neighborhood. So thus, what we're looking for is a different kind of regime. It doesn't have to be a regime that we would embrace, we Americans would embrace as, say, qualifying to join the European Union if the European Union would take Middle Eastern countries. But it does have to not sponsor terrorism or allow terrorism to rise up on its territory, as we saw with ISIS. It cannot use chemical weapons against its own people or anybody else. It cannot be a launching pad for another country's hegemonic intentions in the region, specifically in the case of Syria, Iran. It cannot torture and treat its own population terribly without being held to account. It has to provide an environment where refugees will voluntarily and safely return, which of course this regime doesn't. If the regime can meet these basic requirements with this political process, then while we may not like it, the bulk of the world, I think, will be willing to live with it and help it come back up to its feet. But right now it's far from that.
Sir in the back.
Thank you very much. Josh Rogan, Washington Post. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your service. You mentioned a couple of times the attack a few days ago on U.S. partner forces inside the Al-Tanf zone. What happened there?
We're still looking into the details.
Okay. And second part of the question is, you mentioned the Al-Rukban refugee camp, which is inside the Al-Tanf zone. 50,000 people starving to death. Of course, the UN envoys are held up by the regime and the Russians, but all of the information we hear from the Russians blames the United States for the plight of these people. Is there a way for the United States government to provide these starving people the food, medicine, and water that they desperately need?
Yeah, our concern is not that they're starving people, but that eventually they will be starving people if we don't find a way to regularly provide relief to them. With the cooperation of the regime and the Russians, at the end of October, we did get a convoy through. That was an important development. We're running into trouble primarily with the Russians at the moment. The UN is in the middle. The UN has been very good. They're preparing a new plan to bring supplies in that will be shared with the Russians and the regime, but basically this is a lack of Russian cooperation. The United States military, technically the coalition against ISIS, has provided all kinds of assurances. The first, in terms of security, the first delivery went flawlessly. There was no security threat to it. We just don't see where the beef is. Thus, we consider this a totally political move to try to squeeze us in another area where the Russians claim that we are illegitimately and illegally present.
In the back as well, then we'll come to the front, I promise.
Puya Bakai, what is our policy with respect to SDF? Do we have one? In the past, we have provided them with arms, we have provided them with training, we have provided them air support. Are we going to withdraw our support, or are we going to support PYD and SDF?
First of all, we are supporting them for a specific goal, which is the defeat of ISIS, because they are a force that was fighting ISIS, and they have done this very effectively. It's in their interest to fight ISIS. They're not doing this as a favor for us. They're doing this for their own security. Remember when we first partnered with them, it was in Kobani in 2014 when they were being pushed up against the Turkish border by an ISIS offensive. In terms of what's the future like, the analogy I would give you is, and many of you were involved in this because you've been doing Middle East foreign policy for years, we supported groups like the PUK, the KDP, and the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq in the period of time between 1991 and 2003 in our diplomatic effort to get a change of regime in Iraq. Those were our partners for a tactical and transactional relationship for a specific goal. We achieved the goal. What did we do? What we did was try to put together a Iraqi state, government, and society and constitution that would allow those political parties and all other political parties to compete in a normal and natural and peaceful way without the kind of horror that we had under Saddam. So the eventual goal with the SDF is for the SDF, just like the other political parties that we have supported in the past, that the Turks are still supporting, that other countries are supporting, to become part of the fabric of a changed Syrian society. That is, we don't have permanent relationships with sub-state entities. That's not the policy of this administration. It basically hasn't been the policy of other administrations. If you talk about long-term support in a political military sense and being their partner in long-term governance, it's just simply not what we do. So in the long run, the solution for all of the groups in Syria is a reformed Syrian government, a internationally supported ceasefire, and an international process that gives everybody the chance to live in peace.
Sir?
Thank you. Rojdallah with Rudao TV in Iraqi Kurdistan. Yesterday, about 100 Peshmerga crossed the border into Syria with the knowledge and cooperation from the Americans. Would you be able to tell us what's the role that America sees for this group of Peshmerga? And also on the phone call on Friday between President Erdogan and President Trump, President Erdogan claims that President Trump had an understanding of the planned offensive into northeastern Syria, given that Pentagon not long ago said that something like that would not be acceptable. Now, my question to you is that is there a lack of consensus in Washington on the response to the Turkish offensive or planned offensive into Syria?
Well, once again, we think that any offensive into northeastern Syria by anyone is a bad idea. And that was a position that I conveyed when I was in Ankara, that everybody from the president on down has conveyed. We also understand that the Turks are concerned about the security situation in northeast Syria. They see the PYD at a minimum as a latent threat to them, rather like the Israelis see Hezbollah on their border as a threat to them, rather like the Saudis see the Houthis on their border as a threat to them. And so we have to take that into account. We are taking that into account. We're working with the Turks. We believe that the situation, as I said, is somewhat calmer now than before. One somewhat related thing is the Rojava Peshmerga deployment across the border. That was done with our understanding, but also with the understanding of the SDF. So that's one of the various steps that are being taken.
Sir?
Hi, Safoyon from Washington Institute.
Let's wait to Mike.
Can you please assess the success you anticipate to pushing out Iran's military establishment in Syria within the current policy stature? And also, the last panel talked about many goals without a strategy. Could you speak to that as well?
The presence of Iranian forces, particularly power projection forces, in Syria is first and foremost a concern for Israel, but it's also a concern for every other country that borders Syria, and it's a big concern for the United States as well. We see no reason to tolerate this. We see no reason for this to be there. We see this as sparking a conflict. You saw the incident where the Israelis allegedly struck at a Iranian target. The Syrian Air Force or the Syrian Air Defenses attempted to engage the Israelis, the alleged Israelis, and who did they engage and shoot down but a Russian aircraft. This is the kind of escalation that the Iranian presence brings. So it's not just that we don't like Iranians far from their shores. We just do not like the extremely dangerous situation that they introduce to an already cauldron of danger and horror that is a Syrian internal conflict. So our position is that they need to go. We have asked the Russians many times why it is in Russia's interest for them to be there doing these kind of things. We understand why it's in Russia's interest for the Iranians to provide infantry to help the Assad regime recover territory, which the Assad regime on its own can't recover. But why do they need long-range missiles? And the Russians have not given us a good answer. We do think that as part of an overall compromise settlement of this conflict, where foreign armies would leave, as they usually do, at the end of conflicts, or at least in many cases, the Iranians would be one of those foreign armies that leave. That would be a condition of moving forward on the political process, moving forward on the normalization of the Assad regime or the successor regime status. That's the strategy. We have the three objectives which I gave, and the strategy is to use these various levers, the lever of all these military forces running around, the escalatory danger that is inherent to such a situation, the fact that half the population will not return to a regime like this, the fact that much of the territory and many of the more valuable resources such as oil and gas are not in the hands of the regime, and the fact that the rebuilding of this country, which will have to happen, cannot be funded by Assad and friends, Iran and Russia. It has to be funded by the entire international community, and until we see a political process that delivers on the things we need, we don't think that that's going to happen. That's the strategy.
Okay. I think we have time for just two more questions. So I'm going to ask for both of those questions to come and then answer both at the same time. Sir in the blue jacket, you've been very patient, and then you on the side. Yes, both of you two.
Thank you very much. Very informative. Hisham Jabi at Titratek, MSI. My question is about the enduring defeat of ISIS. I think one of the most important pull and push factors that ISIS used in northeast and around Euphrates is the grievances. And how can we guarantee that we're pushing for stabilization programs while we're not doing unintended consequences? I just hear from Deir Zur, for example, Civil Council, they're pushing back on certain of the programs that U.S. government is trying to put together to help essential services and others. They have their own agenda, they have their own bodies and stuff like that. So how can we really make sure that we're not really getting into the same trap that could be probably, to start with, brought ISIS into this area?
Well,
okay. And then let's just get the last question as well. We have that one, and then the other, and then we done, please.
Matthew Kennedy. I recently finished the master's degree in Chinese politics from SOAS in London. This is kind of an odd question. Ambassador, what are the Chinese interests in the current process, and what role have they been playing in the whole situation?
Yeah, let me start with stabilization. Look, as somebody who spent a fair amount of the last 20 years on one or another form of stabilization by one or another name, nobody knows how to do this. Many times we are successful enough to keep the state or the area from falling back, or somebody else is successful enough to falling back into the same old violence, the same old dysfunctionality, the same old chaos that produced us going in or somebody else going in the first place. Sometimes you're not. It's a question of money, but we had a great deal of money in Iraq. We were only partially successful. We were successful in a constitution that by and large is holding. We were successful in assisting the Iraqis in accepting and embracing a democratic system of governance, of voting. We were certainly successful on the oil fields, but on other areas we're less successful. It's just very hard to, you have limited funds. The president has decided that it's the job of other countries to provide stabilization funding. We've received $300 million since the spring, along with other funds and other accounts, and our own humanitarian spending, funding, which we continue to do throughout Syria. And is that enough? We're using it for various projects. We can always use more money. But the question of whether people will return to ISIS or return to the regime or return to some other political posture is one that goes far beyond whether you're effective in stabilization. I'm not denigrating effective stabilization. It makes a difference, but it's not the only factor. And we'll see. In terms of the Chinese, my general impression, and I was in China a few years ago to talk to them about this, China's challenge to the American-led collective security regional and global system is real and worrisome. But it is also prudent and cautious. Right now, they're challenging it in areas from the South China Sea to some degree the Korean Peninsula, where they have a relatively higher degree of military capability, but also very strong trade links with the people, the states in the region. In the Middle East, while they're a major importer of hydrocarbons out of the region, they're not a major economic player, not like in East Asia, not like in Africa, and they have zero military presence and almost no diplomatic presence. But there is something that is interesting. If you look at the votes in the Security Council and the General Assembly on Syria, you will see that the Chinese often diverge from the Russians. Where the Russians will veto, the Chinese often simply abstain. That indicates some degree of concern about, I think, Russia's very aggressive role in the region. I don't quite know what it is. One argument is that for the Chinese, a stable Middle East is very important because it still provides many of its hydrocarbons, and it doesn't necessarily trust Russia, which is its other major source of hydrocarbons, with ever more in the future, but an interest in a high price for every cubic meter of gas or barrel of oil it sells, not necessarily being the biggest fan of a very stable, quiet Middle East that can compete very, very effectively against Russia for hydrocarbon sales. So I think that they understand that there is a certain divergence of interest based upon the fact that Russia wants to play a geostrategic role in the region. China certainly does not right now, and a difference on the views of hydrocarbons generally. So that's the interesting thing. Basically, it's the dog that didn't bark. I can take another question if you got time.
One more question?
Sure.
Okay.
Henri Baki, what about
Thank you, Jim. Henri Baki at the High University. Jim, you're making an assumption that Assad wants to rebuild his country. Assad wants to conquer back the territories. He may be very happy with what he has. He doesn't want the population that left Syria to come back because of potential problems for him. So he may sit and wait it out and wait for everybody else to essentially give in to him, and he can go on for a very, very long time. That's one. And secondly, would you, given the example you gave with the KRG, would you see a SRG in the future?
I wouldn't predict anything in terms of the future. And this comes up all of the time. Again, there was a reason I quoted from the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy. In the 1990s, where that kind of thinking had been banned to the dustbin of history, we would care deeply about the basics of a country not being a pariah politically and not being, destitute and dysfunctional economically. But if a country is going to array itself on the other side of a fairly Manichaean, our side, this side, kind of conflict environment, which is what, again, these documents predict, and for good reason, because I think it reflects reality, then what we have right now is an Assad that is very weak. Would you concede that, in terms of his ability to project power and threaten anybody? No, but his ability to do damage to other people, because most of the people who we would want to do damage to have fled, his ability to seize more territory in his own country, let alone threaten his neighbors, is zero right now. He has to rely totally on the Russians and the Iranians, and we'll see how willing they are to indulge him further. This isn't a victory, but it's better than a healthy Assad with 20 million people and a 750,000 armed forces with modern Russian equipment that is in cahoots with the Russians and the Iranians and trying to change the security situation in the entire region. I mean, we want to see through 2254 a change in the situation there that will allow refugees to go back, that will allow the 20 million people, minus the 500,000 who've been killed, to return to a normal life. But that's something that we will not, if, you know, we can't get that on our terms, we can only get that on Assad's terms, well then shucks, we're just going to have to get it on Assad's terms. If that is his strategy, I think he's going to have to wait an awfully long time. And meanwhile, the resources we will devote to this conflict compared to the resources we devote to trying to contain Russia, trying to deal with China, even trying to deal with the situation in Afghanistan are very, very limited, and mainly in the area of taking care of refugees. But beyond that, this is something that's certainly sustainable for us.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We really appreciate the time. Thank you. And thank you everyone else for coming to the Atlantic Council.